let me start with background. And I confess to having worked in 1977 on one of the first efforts to uncover the nature of U.S. controls at that time, prior to the NNPA, over back-end fuel cycle activities. And until the NNPA was enacted, we had essentially no controls whatsoever. We had a process that was called the MB10 process, which I described in a petition that I submitted to the Energy Research and Development Administration as a process that was reminiscent of litigation described by Charles Dickens in Bleak House, where there were dusty old files hidden away somewhere, and it was unclear what procedures applied to approval of fuel cycle activities. The standards were extraordinarily difficult to discern. And frankly, the situation was a mess. It was a major impetus to enactment of the NNPA in 1977 and 1978. Congress realized at that point in time that it had to bring U.S. controls over back-end fuel cycles activities by our partners under control. And that was taking place at a time when both President Ford and then President Carter recognized the risks associated particularly with reprocessing and with breeder reactors. So what happened in 1978 was that Congress did enact the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act. And it's a remarkable law, to my judgment, even when looked back from the perspective of 40 years, in that it was an effort to impose significant restraints on how the executive conducted nuclear cooperation activities with our allies. And a central goal of the NNPA was to ensure that back-end fuel cycle activities took place under conditions which reduced to the maximum extent possible the risks of nuclear proliferation. I won't bore you with a detailed analysis of the language of the statute and its legislative history and structure, but suffice it to say that what Congress was interested in doing, and this is reflected particularly in the legislative history, was establishing what they characterized in the House and Senate reports as clear, unambiguous, and simple rules governing fuel cycle activities. And one of the essential elements of the controls that the United States was imposing, that the United States was have what are called consent rights with respect to fuel cycle activities. And it was contemplated, as far as I'm concerned, by almost everyone involved in the elaboration of the NNPA, that these consent rights were going to be exercised on an iterative basis over the term of our agreements for cooperation with our allies. That is, there's really a tripartite structure to the NNPA. First, agreements for cooperation are entered into, and the law establishes that one of the elements of an agreement for cooperation is the retention of consent rights by the United States. Secondly, the Act contemplates that licensing activities will be undertaken. And if you look at the criteria for licensing, one of the key criteria is that consent be maintained over fuel cycle activities of our partners. And finally, there's a provision of the law, Section 131, which establishes an elaborate procedure for what were called subsequent arrangements. And these were arrangements to approve fuel cycle activities after fuel had been burned in reactors. And there's frankly no doubt in my mind that Congress did not contemplate at that time that these consent rights be exercised in advance for the life of an agreement without regard to issues such as timely warning of diversions.